Human beings were seafarers as much as 50,000 years ago. Like the island of Cyprus. The nearest Turkish coast is about 60 kilometers from there. It's always been surrounded by huge deeps. It's always been an island, even at the peak of the sea level, lowest sea level during the Ice Age. Cyprus was always an island. And yet, there's evidence now that it was settled 14,000 years ago. It was settled, in other words, during the Ice Age. And these were large planned migrations. And they reckon that populations of 1,000 or so were being brought across that water, across the ocean, across the Mediterranean Sea to Cyprus near the end of the last Ice Age. But not a single ship has survived to testify to that. Same with Australia. 50,000 years ago, human beings got there, and even at the lowest sea level, they would have had to cross about 90 kilometers of open water. Have you been there?
No, I haven't.
What an incredible, ethereal, otherworldly place. And there, yes, they found human footprints dated back more than 23,000 years.
What do they think that environment was like 22,000 years ago?
Well, it would still have been like that. It would have been gypsum dunes.
Wow.
It's a very fine, very white sand.
So they found footprints there, and these are absolutely human footprints.
What's amazing when you actually see the footprints is you can see the interactions between the human beings and animals. You can see that somebody is reacting to a giant sloth which has suddenly turned around, and the person who's behind it suddenly turns around as well.
Wow.
There's mammoth footprints overlaying human footprints, and then human footprints overlaying those.
Wow.
And it goes down for meters under the ground. Impressions that have been left behind by our ancestors and by animals that are now completely extinct. Mammoths and mastodons went extinct during the Younger Dryas, but there are their footprints from 23,000 years ago, side by side with the footprints of human beings. Archaeology has been very reluctant to accept a much older peopling of the Americas, and it's accepted that human beings came here long before 13,000 years ago. And White Sands is one of the places which provides just absolute, definite, irrefutable evidence of that they were here 23,000 years ago. But we don't know yet how long before that they were here. A site called the Cerruti Mastodon site in San Diego. And they are convinced that they are looking at human traces there. It was a butchering of a mastodon, but the way the bones were broken and the marrow was extracted, they don't see any other way that this could have been done except by human beings. And it's 130,000 years old, not 23,000 years old, not 13,000 years old, but 130,000 years old. And this opens the possibility that human beings have been in the Americas before they were in Europe. An archaeologist, Martti Parsanen from the University of Helsinki, and a geographer from Brazil, Alceu Ranzi. Alceu, years ago, was the first person who noticed that there are these huge geometrical structures emerging out of the Amazon jungle, and he noticed it on a flight on a commercial aircraft in an area that happened to have been cleared by local farmers for planting crops. That there was this massive geometrical earthwork there, and that. He actually coined the term geoglyphs for these because he compared them in some ways with the Nazca lines, which again are really only visible from the air. You get suddenly the massive scope and extent of these things, and it's same with the geoglyphs in the Amazon. But now with LiDAR, it's possible to find these things without damaging any rainforest at all. And we had a LiDAR expert with us. He found you can see the edge of the rainforest where the clearances stop and the rainforest hasn't yet been interfered with. And then he flies over there, and within a matter of hours, he's found multiple more of these structures, several.
That are deep in the rainforest.
Covered completely. And LiDAR allows him to see through the canopy and to see what's underneath it without damaging it. And there are these huge earthworks. And this raises the question, how much more is there in the Amazon to find?
They've determined that the Amazon rainforest is at least partially man-made.
Definitely. They've determined that because of the preponderance of trees that serve human needs. They call them hyperdominant, and things like Brazil nut trees, which are providing food for human beings, are in massive dominance in relation to trees that aren't useful to human beings. And it's clear that this is the result of a long-term human project to make this jungle serve human needs. These food plants show that human beings have been nurturing, have been massaging this natural wonder and turning it into something that really serves human needs.
And there's the other thing that you've discussed in depth, the terra preta. this man-made, incredibly rich, nutrient-dense soil that they can grow incredible agriculture off of, that we really to this day don't know how they created.
It's a mystery. Indigenous communities in the Amazon are still doing this. They're still doing it, mixing all kind of refuse and waste together and enriching the soil with it. So it's not stopped. Terra preta is still being made, but most of it is very old, and the oldest that they found so far is about 8,000 years old. I have mentioned it to you before. The expedition of Gaspar de Carvajal and his chronicler Francisco de Orellana, which was an accidental expedition. They were just going hunting in a longboat, but the Amazon took them and wouldn't let them go back. And they traveled 4,000 miles across South America and ended up they started on the Pacific side and ended up in the Atlantic Ocean.
Wow.
And that's in the 1560s, and they report seeing enormous, thriving, prosperous cities, highly civilized with advanced arts and crafts.
Wow.
And they were not believed because 100 years later, when other Spaniards made that voyage and went into the Amazon, they couldn't find the cities. And the reason they couldn't find them is precisely the reason that you give, which is that the jungle had eaten those cities because the human population had been wiped out by disease brought by the Spaniards. The Spaniards didn't have to have direct contact with those indigenous peoples in the middle of the Amazon. The diseases just jumped from population to population and just killed everybody.
Everyone knows there was a genocide of Native Americans in this country, but most people don't know that 90% of them were wiped out by disease.
Absolutely. It's an early example of a biological weapon.
Yeah. Right?
And to some extent, it was used deliberately as a biological weapon, like those smallpox-infected blankets.
Is that true?
From what I've looked at from the Spanish conquest of Mexico, there was a realization that we can kill these people with smallpox. We have some immunity to it that they don't have.
Right, because we had it forever.
The Roman occupation of
it's
Egypt was the beginning of the end.
To put it into
Egypt.
perspective, I always use this quote: Cleopatra lived closer to the invention of the iPhone than she did to the construction of the pyramids.
Looking at the stone vases from ancient Egypt.
This is a 3D print of
That's
one.
a 3D print of one of those.
This is a 3D print of an actual stone vase. Yeah. And it might be like not that exciting to people, like, oh, what's the big deal? What the big deal is the precision in which this was constructed with handles on it. So it couldn't have been spun on a lathe.
No.
Because it has these two handles that are also cut out of the stone.
Yeah.
And everything is precise to within thousands of a human hair.
Yeah.
Which is bananas.
Yeah. There's another piece which it's hard to describe, but it's got a series of 3 flanges that come across. It's like a wheel, but nobody knows what it is, and it's cut out of incredibly hard rock, or cut or shaped in some way. I've never seen a satisfactory explanation for this. When I first saw that in the Cairo Museum, it's cut from schist. This thing is hard.
It looks like a piece of an engine.
It does, doesn't it? It looks
that looks like something I'd find on my Land Cruiser. What is the conventional explanation of what this thing is?
Some kind of offering bowl.
Wow, that's wild. Do they have any sort of an or a guess of how someone would cut something like that out of stone?
I've never seen a satisfactory guess.
I think it was used in brewing beer as a mash rake to mix and even out the mixture of grains and hot water.
But those like Chris Dunn, who are studying the technology of ancient Egypt, are confident that we're looking at the traces of a lost technology. We don't know how this was done. Like so much else in ancient Egypt, like we don't know how the 70-ton blocks were raised to become the roof of the king's chamber either in the Great Pyramid. There's so much that we don't know. The ancient Egyptian notion of a leap to the sky after death, to the Milky Way, of a journey along the Milky Way, of encountering challenges and dangers and risks there, monsters that would block your path, gates that you had to know the password to get through. That idea is found all over the world. The path of souls. It's found all over the Americas. That.
What do you think that they're trying to say?
Well, I think first of all it's evidence of a remote common origin of this idea. It's when it's found amongst cultures all around the world that apparently had no contact with one another and are often separated by hundreds or thousands of years. The same idea is found about what happens to us after death. The only reasonable explanation I can come up with is that they've all inherited this idea and then developed it in their own ways from a remote common source. And that's one of the main reasons that I'm curious about the possibility of a lost civilization. The Amazon rainforest was a bountiful place, and the Sahara Desert was green and rich for thousands of years during the Ice Age, with lakes, with rivers. It was the kind of place where a civilization might well have emerged.
They find whale bones.
Whale bones,
there.
yeah.
Whales.
Yeah.
So anybody who doesn't think there's a mystery in the Sahara Desert,
yeah,
and anybody who really tries to dismiss the notion that most of it hasn't been really excavated, but it really hasn't been.
No, it hasn't. It's
too vast.
It's too vast, and it's too expensive.
And it's also like there's so many of those things that people thought were myth, like Troy.
Troy, yeah.
And they find it. And
found
by
an amateur. Turns out to be a real place. I think the myths are the memory banks of our species. But they're the memories we have from the time before writing, from the time before documents were kept. And they're a precious resource in understanding our past. If there was a lost civilization at all, I think we're looking at a terrible cataclysm. Part of it happened near Göbekli Tepe. A terrible cataclysm with relatively few survivors. And that those survivors, just as we would do today, took refuge amongst people who'd made it through the disaster better. And those people who'd made it through would most likely have been hunter-gatherers. But I think Göbekli Tepe is such an important site that underneath that place there are dozens of huge unexcavated stone circles with enormous megalithic pillars in them, all under the ground. Turkish archaeologists, it's interesting, are calling this now a civilization. They're calling it the Tas Tepeler civilization, the Stone Hills civilization. And they're finding that the same iconography, the same building techniques, not quite on the scale of Göbekli Tepe, are repeated all across the region. They extend all the way down to the south of the Jordan Valley, to Jericho. The ancient site of Jericho is part of that lost or emerging civilization that appeared at the end of the Younger Dryas. Cyprus is another example I was mentioning about how it was settled in what appear to have been planned, organized settlement events near the end of the last ice age. Again, you find that same iconography that you find at Göbekli Tepe turning up there.
Which
as well.
Iconography specifically?
The tendency to use T-shaped pillars, to use certain designs like a V-shaped necklace.
Is the size and scale of Göbekli Tepe unique in comparison to the ones that are around it?
Yes, so far. The ones that have been found, Göbekli Tepe is unique, and I think it's clear now that Göbekli Tepe itself was the end of a process, not the beginning of a process. It's something that brought together the best of everything that they'd accumulated and created it in one place, and left it there, finally at the end burying it, sealing it as a time capsule, which then was untouched for more than 10,000 years before Klaus Schmidt opened it up in 1996. I think that what we're looking at in that whole area is the outcome of contact with an earlier largely lost civilization. I think it passed on its cultural genes right there in that area of Turkey and down into the Jordan Valley and Cyprus. And not only there, also the Indus Valley civilization. And it suggests that cultural ideas way back in the remote past were being spread around the world very, very rapidly. We're seeing a sudden emergence of something that is being recognized as a civilization in Turkey just immediately after Göbekli Tepe, around the time of Göbekli Tepe. And we're seeing it in the Jordan Valley, and we're seeing it in the Indus Valley, and we're seeing it in South America as well. The same iconography keeps on repeating, and I don't think it's a coincidence. And what we're trying to show is that the story in the Americas is much older than it's been, and that there are mysteries here that have never been explained by archaeology.
How much of the Amazon has been explored with LiDAR?
A very tiny proportion. I worked with the team who are doing this, and they're solely in the province of Acre, in the southwest of Brazil. And they haven't worked in other areas. What would be needed, I'm hoping some amazing philanthropist will come forward, and if such a philanthropist will come forward, I can connect him with the people who are doing the work in Acre, that we have a LiDAR survey of the whole of the Amazon.